Welcome back to Celestial Scrolls, where ancient Chinese myths and legends come alive through storytelling. Today, we continue our epic journey with Chapter 37 of Journey to the West, the Village of Broken Connections. In our previous episode, Tang Sanzang and his disciples helped the City of Endless Competition rediscover the balance between individual achievement and collective well-being. This chapter brings our heroes to perhaps their most challenging community yet, a village where the very fabric of human connection has been torn apart by mistrust and accumulated resentments. The road from the city of balanced achievement led through increasingly isolated countryside, where farmhouses stood far apart and travelers grew scarce. The very landscape seemed to reflect a pattern of separation, fields divided by unnecessary walls, paths that diverged when they could have converged, bridges that had been built but then abandoned before completion. Tang Sanzang noticed these signs first, his transformed perception attuned to the subtle indicators of human disconnection. "Observe how the infrastructure here speaks of division," he pointed out to his disciples as they passed a partially constructed market pavilion that had clearly been abandoned mid-project. This was meant to bring people together, but something prevented its completion. Wukong, scouting ahead with his enhanced vision, reported troubling observations. "Master, I see smoke from many chimneys ahead, indicating a substantial community. But the people move strangely. They avoid each other's paths, take roundabout routes to their destinations, and seem to communicate only when absolutely necessary." As they approached what appeared to be the village proper, they encountered their first resident, an elderly woman carrying water buckets who took one look at their group and immediately changed direction to avoid them entirely. When Tang Sanzang called out a polite greeting, she hunched her shoulders and walked faster, as if conversation itself posed a threat. The village, when they finally reached it, presented a peculiar sight. All the necessary elements of community life were present: homes, shops, wells, meeting areas, but they existed in isolation from each other. People emerged from their houses to conduct necessary business, but they did so with elaborate timing designed to minimize contact with neighbors. When encounters were unavoidable, residents spoke in clipped, formal tones while avoiding eye contact. A sign at the village edge read simply, "Separation Village. Population 247. Please respect individual boundaries." The first person willing to speak with them was the village clerk, a tired-looking man whose office sat prominently in the center of the community, but felt as isolated as a tower on a mountain peak. His desk was positioned so that he could conduct business through a window without inviting anyone inside. "Travelers?" he asked through the window, his tone suggesting that visitors were unusual and possibly unwelcome. "I suppose you'll need accommodation. We have an inn, though it operates somewhat differently than you might expect." "We would be grateful for lodging and any guidance you could offer about your community," Tang Sanzang replied politely. The clerk's expression grew wary. "Guidance? About what, specifically? We don't encourage involvement in local matters. People here prefer privacy. We've learned it's safer that way." "Safer? From what?" Sha Wujing asked gently. The clerk's face darkened. "From disappointment, from betrayal, from the complications that arise when people get too connected. We found that Maintaining appropriate distance prevents most problems. He provided them with directions to the inn while carefully avoiding any information that might encourage them to linger or engage with other residents. The inn itself proved to be a marvel of isolation. Individual rooms with separate entrances, meals delivered to doors rather than shared in a common area, and strict policies against disturbing other guests with unnecessary social interaction. The innkeeper, a woman whose suspicious eyes suggested long experience with disappointment, explained the rules with weary efficiency. Payment in advance, no gatherings in rooms, no lending or borrowing between guests, no assistance offered to other patrons unless specifically requested through written notice to management. Questions about local affairs are discouraged. As they settled into their oddly isolating accommodations, the travelers began to piece together the village's history through overheard fragments and careful observation. This had once been a thriving, close-knit community called Harmony Village, where families intermarried, businesses collaborated closely, and neighbors shared resources freely. But something had gone wrong. Not a single dramatic event, but a series of conflicts, misunderstandings, and betrayals that had gradually poisoned the atmosphere of trust. Business partnerships had ended in bitter disputes. Marriages had dissolved into public scandals. Friends had chosen sides in arguments until the entire community was divided into factions that couldn't bear contact with each other. Eventually, the residents had decided that the solution was complete social distance. If people didn't get close, they couldn't hurt each other. If relationships remained superficial, betrayals couldn't cut deep. If expectations were minimal, disappointments would be manageable. The result was a community that functioned efficiently but felt spiritually dead. A collection of individuals who happened to live in proximity but shared nothing meaningful. This may be our greatest challenge yet, Tang Sanzang admitted to his disciples as they gathered quietly in his room to discuss their observations. In the valley, we helped people rediscover hope. In the city, we helped them balance individual and collective goals. But here, we must help heal wounds that have grown infected through years of avoidance. The people here aren't suffering from too little connection or too much competition, Wukong observed. They're protecting themselves from a connection because they've been hurt by it. And unlike our previous communities, they've actively chosen their isolation, Baji added thoughtfully. They see their separation as a solution, not a problem. Xiao Wujing nodded slowly. Which means they'll resist any attempt to bring them together. They've learned to equate closeness with danger. Their first attempts at service seemed to confirm these fears. When Baji offered to help a struggling shopkeeper organize his inventory, the man recoiled as if offered poison. "What do you want in return?" he demanded suspiciously. "Nobody helps without expecting something back. I've learned that lesson." When Wukong tried to assist an elderly man who had dropped his packages, the response was even more hostile. "Keep your hands off my belongings. I don't know what scheme you're running, but I'm not falling for it." Even Tang Sanzang's attempts at simple conversation were met with suspicion and deflection. People seemed to assume that any interest in their lives was preparation for some form of manipulation or betrayal. The breakthrough came through the village children who had not yet fully absorbed their parents' defensive isolation. a small girl named May Finn, perhaps 6 years old, was playing alone in a dusty courtyard when she scraped her knee on a rough stone. Her crying brought no response from the nearby adults, who had learned to avoid involvement in others' problems. Sha Wujing, unable to ignore a child's distress despite the village customs, approached carefully and offered to clean and bandage the wound. Mei Fin, too young to understand the complex social prohibitions that governed adult behavior, accepted his help gratefully. "Thank you, uncle," she said simply, using the traditional term of respect for helpful adults. "Mama says I shouldn't talk to strangers, but you have kind eyes." This innocent exchange was observed by several adults, who reacted with alarm, not at Sha Wujing's kindness, but at their own responses to witnessing it. Despite their protective cynicism, they couldn't help feeling touched by the simple interaction between adult compassion and childhood trust. More significantly, Mei Fin's mother emerged from her house to check on her daughter and found herself faced with a dilemma. Every instinct trained by years of defensive isolation told her to snatch her child away from the stranger, but she could see that her daughter was genuinely unhurt and that the stranger had acted with obvious care. "I thank you," she said reluctantly to Sha Wujing. "You didn't have to, but thank you." This small crack in the village's wall of isolation became the opening through which transformation could begin. Word spread that the strangers had helped a child without seeking anything in return, an action so unprecedented that it challenged everyone's carefully constructed assumptions about human motivation. Gradually, other opportunities for simple kindness arose. When an elderly woman's roof began leaking during a sudden rainstorm, Wukong repaired it quickly and efficiently, then disappeared before she could formulate appropriate suspicions about his motives. When a merchant's cart broke down in front of the inn, Baji fixed the wheel and refused any payment, explaining that he simply enjoyed working with his hands. Each act of uncomplicated kindness forced the villagers to confront their defensive assumptions. If these strangers were helping without expecting anything in return, perhaps not all human interaction was inherently exploitative. If kindness could exist without hidden agendas, perhaps their protective isolation was no longer necessary. The real transformation began when Mei Fin's innocent trust started to spread to other children. Too young to fully understand the adult world's complex resentments, they began approaching the travelers with the natural curiosity and openness that their parents had learned to suppress. Tang Sanzang found himself surrounded by children during his morning meditations, their presence gradually creating a sense of peace that had been absent from the village for years. When their parents came to collect them, expecting to find trouble, they instead discovered their children participating in moments of genuine tranquility. "They seem happier," observed one mother, speaking to Tang Sanzang with careful formality but obvious curiosity. "My daughter has been laughing more since you arrived. I had almost forgotten what her laughter sounded like." "Children remember what adults sometimes forget," Tang Sanzang replied gently. "That connection brings joy as well as risk, and that the joy often outweighs the risk." The woman was quiet for a long moment. "But the risk is real," she finally said. "People do hurt each other. Trust does get betrayed. I've seen it happen over and over." "Yes," Tang Sanzang agreed, "and when that happens, We can choose to close our hearts forever, or we can learn to trust more wisely while remaining open to connection. The choice shapes not just our safety, but our capacity for joy. This conversation, overheard by other parents who had come to collect their children, planted seeds of questioning in minds that had been closed to alternatives for years. If their children could find happiness through connection with strangers, perhaps the village's strategy of complete isolation wasn't the only solution to human conflict. The turning point came during a crisis that the village's isolation policies were entirely inadequate to handle. A fire broke out in the granary that stored the community's winter food supply, a disaster that threatened everyone's survival regardless of their social boundaries. In the face of this emergency, the artificial barriers between residents began to crumble. People who hadn't spoken in years found themselves working side by side to form bucket brigades. Former enemies collaborated to evacuate grain and equipment. The very survival of the community required the kind of cooperation that their defensive isolation had made impossible. Tang Sanzang and his disciples threw themselves into the firefighting effort, but more importantly, they served as bridges between villagers who had forgotten how to work together. When two men who had been feuding for years found themselves paralyzed by old resentments, even in the face of crisis, Wukong stepped between them. "Your argument is with each other," he said firmly but kindly. "The fire doesn't care about your disagreement. Save your community first, then decide whether your feud is worth maintaining." Similar moments of mediation occurred throughout the crisis as the travelers helped villagers remember that their survival depended on cooperation, not separation. More profoundly, many residents rediscovered that working together toward a common goal felt better than maintaining isolated self-sufficiency. When the fire was finally extinguished and the damage assessed, the community faced a choice. They could return to their protective isolation, having learned that it failed them in crisis, or they could begin the difficult work of rebuilding not just their granary, but their capacity for trust. The children, who had never fully accepted the adult world's defensive barriers, became unexpected advocates for reconnection. "Why can't we eat together sometimes?" asked Mayfin at a community meeting called to discuss reconstruction. "Uncle Shah says sharing food makes it taste better." "And why can't we have festivals again?" added another child. "Grandmother told me stories about when people used to celebrate together." The adults found themselves without good answers to these innocent questions. Their protective isolation had indeed prevented some forms of hurt, but it had also prevented all forms of joy that came through connection. Gradually, tentatively, the village began to experiment with limited forms of community rebuilding. They started with practical cooperation, shared work projects where people could collaborate without having to fully trust each other. They organized community meals where attendance was voluntary and conversation was kept to safe topics. Most importantly, they began to develop new social norms that honored both connection and caution. They created protocols for handling conflicts before they could poison relationships. They established clear boundaries that allowed for cooperation without forced intimacy. They learned to distinguish between healthy caution and destructive cynicism. The process was slow, often painful, and frequently interrupted by setbacks when old wounds reopened or new conflicts arose. But the children's natural capacity for connection provided a constant reminder of what the community could become if its adults were willing to risk growth. After 2 months in the village, Tang Sanzang recognized that their most important work was complete. The villagers had not returned to naive trust, but they had begun to develop mature discernment. The ability to form connections while maintaining appropriate boundaries, to forgive past hurts without forgetting the lessons they taught, to remain open to joy while protecting themselves from exploitation. "You haven't fixed our problems," observed the village clerk on the day they prepared to leave. His title had evolved to community coordinator, as his role expanded beyond mere record-keeping to helping facilitate the village's gradual reconnection. People still disagree. Some relationships are still strained. We're still learning how to balance trust with caution. Perfection was never the goal, Tang Sanzang replied gently. Growth was. Learning was. The willingness to keep trying despite past disappointments. The village they left behind had renamed itself New Connections Village, acknowledging both their painful history and their commitment to building something better. It wasn't a return to naive harmony, but an evolution toward mature community. Relationships built on realistic understanding rather than either blind trust or defensive isolation. As they departed, the travelers reflected on their most complex challenge yet. They had learned that healing relationships requires different wisdom than fixing individual problems. Patience with setbacks, acceptance of imperfection, and faith in gradual growth. Perhaps the greatest wisdom we shared, Sha Wujing observed, was helping them understand that avoiding all risk of hurt also means avoiding all possibility of joy. And that concludes Chapter 37. Tang Sanzang and his disciples helped the village of broken connections begin the delicate work of rebuilding trust after years of defensive isolation, learning that healing relationships requires patience, acceptance of imperfection, and faith in gradual growth. If you enjoyed watching our heroes navigate broken trust and help a community rediscover balance between connection and healthy boundaries, please like and share your thoughts below. Subscribe for Chapter 38, where our transformed travelers continue discovering the endless varieties of human wisdom and ways understanding can be shared. Thank you for joining us on this journey of relationship healing and the patient work of rebuilding community.